start at 10:44. Good morning. Thank you guys for coming, getting up fairly early for some, depending on if you were hanging out at Oktoberfest last night like we were. So I'm Cheryl W. Thompson. As some of you know, I'm an investigative correspondent for National Public Radio in Washington. I'm also president of Investigative Reporters and Editors, so welcome. And my colleague today, my partner in crime, as we like to say, is Scott Zamost, who's a senior investigative producer for CNBC in New York. So welcome to the art of investigative interviewing. So, and as you guys know, knowing how to conduct an interview takes skill, right, and a little luck. Sometimes it's a lot of luck. You have to ask just the right questions at the right time. And you know, if you ask a tough question at the beginning, your interview could be over before it starts. So you have to be mindful of that. And interviewing for an investigative story is different than a straight-out interview for a feature story, say, or just a regular news story, because there is one constant, and that is you want to be prepared. Now, I'm juggling here with a microphone and PowerPoint. You want to be prepared. You have to know how, that means going into an interview knowing what information you want, right? The information that you hope to get. It also means knowing what concerns the person you're interviewing may have about talking to you and how you're going to diffuse them. You also need a ready answer and a truthful one when the subject asks what the story is about without compromising your investigation. You basically need to become an expert on the subject, right? And that takes a lot of research. I mentioned yesterday a story I did about 6 little black girls in Washington. And when I launched this investigation, they had been killed like almost 50 years ago. They were found, most of them raped, all of them strangled, and left on the freeway, a highway, which became known, the killer became known as the Freeway Phantom because they never have caught him. It ran in the Washington Post magazine, but the first thing I did before interviewing anyone was to learn everything I could about the case and each of the 6 girls. I read reports and news articles starting as far back as 1971. I read witness statements and called sources to get background information and every police document I could get my hands on. Crime scene photos, emergency calls to police, FBI profiles of the possible killer. I did anything that I thought would better prepare me for landing these tough interviews with the family members who I was asking to relive painful events that they had long buried. I needed to ask solid and tough questions and learn everything I could about the murders that would better prepare me to write this story. And when the Washington Post, before I went to NPR in January, I spent 22 years at the Washington Post. When we launched a year-long series on police shootings that ultimately won the Pulitzer Prize for the team of people who worked on it, my role was to investigate everyone who died after being tasered by police. I knew nothing about tasers or how they worked or whether police officers violated policy. But I absorbed everything I could on the subject except being tasered. One cop I called said, well, you come here and we'll taser you. We'll be happy to taser you. No, I don't think so. I said, taser yourself, let me know how it feels, and then call me, and we'll go from there. But now I know the difference between drive stunning and probe tasing, right? I mean, when am I going to use that? Unless I'm a candidate on Jeopardy. But I know policies for using tasers from various police departments around the country. These are the things that I learned by researching. One of the best interviews I did was with a sheriff in Georgia. His officers had tasered this mentally ill young man who had died. They violated policy by tasering him in the wrong place and too many times. But I needed the sheriff to tell me that. I kept calling him. I called and called. He was never at the office. I'm like, where is this sheriff? And he had been sheriff for more than 30 years in Savannah, Georgia, not too far from Atlanta. And so finally, I got a home number, and I called him at home. And his wife answered the phone, and I asked to speak to him, and she put me on hold. She said, just a minute, and there were conversations, there was a baby crying, and I'm on the phone for like 5 minutes and then 10 minutes. And finally she comes back and she says, I'm sorry. She said, he has cancer, so it takes him a while to get to the phone. So I thought, well, that explains why he's never at the office. So anyway, he comes to the phone, and I ask him about this tasering of this young man. And he says, yep, he says, my men basically did the wrong thing. They tasered him. They weren't supposed to do X, Y, and Z. And I fired a lot of the guys, but basically they didn't follow protocol. And I thought, did this sheriff just tell me that his men violated department policy? And he did. So it was great for the story, right? I didn't expect that. And so he hurried me off the phone. I asked him if I could call him back, and he said, okay. So I called him back the next day. We finished the conversation. A day before the story was going to run, it was November, it was right around Thanksgiving in the U.S., and I got a call from a source who said the sheriff died. So, of course, then we have to put that in the story that he died, after this interview. Well, then lawyers got involved, and the family sued, and I was the only one, because the sheriff was dead, I was the only one who had a conversation with the sheriff about his guys violating policy. So, as a journalist, you try not to be subpoenaed. That's what lawyers are for. So our lawyers handled it. I had to give a statement, but I wasn't subpoenaed. And I don't know what the outcome of the lawsuit was, because it didn't involve me, so I kind of stayed clear of it. But it was one of those things where sometimes, I talk about a little luck. I got lucky with that guy because he really did contribute to the story. Another important thing you want to do when you're interviewing is to write down your questions. Yes, I'm on the right PowerPoint. Write down your questions, because chances are you'll have a lot of them, and it's difficult to keep them straight in your mind, and it's also too complicated to listen to your subject's response while thinking of the next question. So having them written down allows you to really focus on what the person is saying and allows you for follow-up without losing track of what you were thinking. Right, we all do that, right? It's like, I'm sorry, what was the next question? But if you have them written down, you can go right to them. I also number my questions. It just helps me when I go back to transcribe. It's like, oh, okay, this was question number 1, here's the response. And having written questions also matters if you're interviewing in person, which I prefer to do, because it's easy for someone to hang up the phone. How many of you have been hung up on? Oh, you're a real journalist. Okay, that's good. But it's harder for them to shut the door in your face, right? And it also may be your only opportunity to interview them. You guys know Bob Woodward? So Bob Woodward I'm an associate professor at George Washington University, and he came to my class once, my investigative class. And I had to lock the door because there were more faculty members there than students. I'm like, this is for the kids. And so Bob is telling this story, and he likes to say there's always a place to go. There's always a scene in which to go to. And he told this story of knocking on the door, since this is being recorded, of this general's house. And the general opens the door. Now, I don't know about you, but the only time you want to see Bob Woodward standing on your front step is if you've invited him to a party. The general sees Bob Woodward. Bob Woodward's standing there looking at the general. What do you think Bob said? Anybody? Please don't close the door. Okay, anybody else? I need your help. Yeah, good luck with that one from a general. I need your help. But that's a good try. He said nothing. He said absolutely nothing. He just stood there. He's standing there. The general's standing there. There's this awkward silence. What do you think happened next? They're just standing there. He invited him in because nobody likes awkward silence during an interview. And if you just keep it quiet, which we're going to talk about a little bit, somebody's going to say something. Let it be the person you're interviewing. So the general says, first of all, before he invited him in, after this awkward silence, he looks at Bob and he goes, "Are you still doing this shit?" And Bob still said nothing. And then the general was like, fine, come on in. Bob got his interview, which I'm sure led to one of his many books, and life went on. So always, remember that. And never, ever lead with the toughest question like we talked about earlier. Never lead with the tough question like, why did you take the money? Right? Or, why did you call the president of Ukraine? It will put your subject on the defensive, and I guarantee they will shut down and you'll get nothing. You'll get nothing. So I remember working on a story on witnesses who were killed because they snitched to police. And I found the case of a man who was gunned down because he saw someone shoot and kill someone on the street. And the suspect had his friends pretend that they wanted to buy this man's car. And the car was for sale in the man's front yard. There was a car in the front yard with a for sale sign in it. And a phone number. So they called him and they told him they wanted to buy the car, see the car. Could you come out and meet us out front? And when you come out, can you wave? Right? So he did. No clue what was about to happen. And he waved. He had his little girl out there with him, his stepdaughter out there. And there was a man in the back seat, a young man in the back seat who rolled down the window, pulled out a gun, and shot the unsuspecting man several times as his girlfriend's daughter and his little girl watched in horror. This was a story that demanded a video interview, so I contacted the victim's mother, who was so grief-stricken that I just knew she wasn't going to talk to me. I knew it. But I called her several times, sometimes just to check on her, see how she was doing. Eventually, I earned her trust, and she agreed to sit down with me and on camera. I told her that perhaps she could help others by sharing her story. People like to help people, and if they think they can, sometimes that works. If you really think they can help people, tell them that maybe your story could help other people. And so when my photographer/videographer was Michael Ducille, who had 3 Pulitzer Prizes, who was the best photographer the Washington Post has ever seen. After that, actually during this, he went over to Liberia. This was during the Ebola crisis. He begged to go back to Liberia, and he actually suffered a heart attack in the middle of nowhere and died. But he was the best photographer ever, and he worked with me on most of my projects. So when we got to her house, I tried to put her at ease by simply saying, "Tell me about your son." It was a great way to get her talking. Just ask people, tell me about that day, tell me about that person, right? And then I asked her about the day he was killed, how she learned about it, and so on. And asking open-ended questions often encourages conversation. So I have a video.
We knew, because he had gotten the subpoena, and we knew that they killed him because he was supposed to testify. And we told the detectives, they said, they got him. He called me after all that went on, and I just got this horrible, sick feeling, and I just said, "Oh God, Carl, what did you do?" He said, "I'll be all right, Mom." He said, "I had to do the right thing." He said, "You should have seen how shot up that man was." They really didn't tell him the truth about how many people Patrick Byers had shot and how violent he was. But the thing for me that would have gave me a little peace of mind is if they had tried and said, "Carl, you got to go hide. We got to put you somewhere. We got to put you in a witness protection thing." Walked up to the car and they dropped the window, and they had a 44 Anaconda, which is a very big gun. I was extremely shocked to see how big the gun was. they dropped the window, and it was a 15-year-old boy. And my son leaned forward, and he saw the gun, and he screamed to the 11-year-old to grab the baby and get her out of there. And they hit him in the chest. And then he grabbed his chest and started to turn, and he hit him in the side of the arm, and the gun was so strong that they found bullets in decks. They found, bullets around that they just went right through his body. My son didn't have one bullet in his body. I gave birth to this. I had the right to hold him, and even though he was gone, I had the right to say, I love you. I was proud of you. You were such a good boy. But they wouldn't let me do it. They told me it was a crime scene. And anybody who loses a child to such a violent death, you're going to carry it forever. I didn't know how some people say you can find closure. I don't know who came up with that, but there's no closure. There's just so much pain. We knew. Because he had gotten the subpoena, and we knew that they killed him because he was supposed to testify.
So there's a backstory that people don't know outside of the Post and Mrs. Shipley, and that is, I need to get back to my PowerPoint here, and that is that this was the second interview I had done with her. The first interview we did, there's always a backstory, right, with an interview. The first interview we did with her, Michael, who was not familiar with video, he was a still photographer, and so while he was doing his photography and trying to do the video while I'm interviewing her, her husband is pacing back and forth in the video the whole time. And we get back to the newsroom, and he's like, oh my God, this is no good. And I'm like, are you kidding me? I have to go back and interview this poor traumatized woman again. His last words to me were actually in an email. He says, I'm sorry I let you down. And then he died after that. So I always remember that. But she was kind enough to let us come back and to interview her a second time. But we had to get that same raw emotion from her. And so the way to do it was to just replay the first interview and ask her again, tell me about your son, because grief like that is like forever. As she said, it doesn't go away. And so if you just ask the same questions, you'll probably get the same response and the same emotion. And that's what I had hoped to get from her. I wanted her anger and I wanted her grief to show through. That's what I did. Because I asked her questions that would take her back to that day when she lost her only child. He was her only child. And so, what did you do when you heard? That must have been agonizing. Tell me about it. And then the information just poured from her. Often as journalists, we feel like we're harassing people, but it's called persistence. Like this PowerPoint is going to be the bane of my existence. There we go. Be persistent. Persistence pays off. My reputation, I think, if somebody said, what's the one thing Cheryl W. Thompson was at the Post, they said she was like dogged. Like, I am a dog with a bone, right? And so persistence, and you have to have it when you're trying to get people to talk, right? They're going to tell you no. No means nothing to me. It's like, that just means come back another day, right? This is come back another day. There was a woman in Texas whose son was, he was mentally ill, and he died at the hands of police with a taser. And she would not talk to me. I called her a gazillion times, and she would not talk. She was nice about it, but she wouldn't talk to me. And finally I said, why won't you talk to me? Like, why won't you let me come to Texas and talk to you? And you know what her response was? People who do television would probably know this. She said, "I don't look good on camera." I'm like, well, neither do I, but we can work this out. And finally she relented. That was her issue. Not that she didn't want to talk, it's just I don't look good on camera. She actually looked fabulous on camera. And so she relented and we went down. And so sometimes you have to deal with reluctant subjects. You have to. And that can be tricky, even for the most seasoned journalist. Several years ago, I began investigating a politician in Maryland. And while reporting the first story, where I learned he was giving job contracts to his friends, timing was everything when it came to interviewing him. He agreed to the interview, but as I kept writing story after story after story, it became increasingly more difficult to interview him because he knew it wasn't going to make him look good, right? He figured it out, didn't take him long, and he started then asking for questions in writing. Oh my God, don't you hate that? When people say, "Can you put your questions in writing?" It's like, no. But if you want the interview, sometimes that's the only way to get it. Sometimes, actually, I used to think, oh, that's horrible, like I'm going to show my hand. Well, you're going to show your hand anyway at some point, right? And so sometimes, actually, particularly when you're dealing with politicians, having questions in writing can be good because then their responses are in writing. Then they can't come back and say, "I didn't say that." Right? So there's an upside to everything. And so the question you should always ask yourself is, when is it safe to interview the person you're investigating? When is it safe to interview the person you're investigating? Often, I know we want to wait, at least I do, until we're close enough to publishing to ask those confrontational questions. But I don't for a lot of reasons, including fairness, because it really is about fairness. I do the confrontational interviews when I've got the documents and the information I need to feel comfortable knowing that the person can't thwart the story, right? If you've got it on lockdown, there is nothing they can do, except I've had people call press conferences. I'm in the middle of a project. I had a police chief once who did that. I was looking at homicides in the district and why D.C. police couldn't close homicide cases. And the new chief came in and saw that I was looking at it, and he was new, and he wanted to look good. And so he called a press conference. Oh man, you talk about mad. I was mad because I'm thinking, there goes my investigation. Here's the thing. Nobody but I knew that we were working on this. So he calls a press conference. Media is there going, huh? Right? They didn't know what I knew. And I remember my editor, Jeff Lean, said to me at the time, he said, "Cheryl, this is July. Nobody's going to remember this press conference by December when we publish." And he was right. So, don't wait until the last minute to do it. And sometimes things like that happen, but just keep pushing on. Another key to successful interviewing is, I call it the Bob Woodward trick again, is knowing when to talk and when not to. We always want to know, particularly broadcast people, no offense. I'm a broadcast person now. We like to show how smart we are, so we talk. Sometimes we just got to shut up, right? Listening is one of the greatest attributes you can have as a journalist. It really is, right? Bob Woodward likes to say, "Let the silence suck out the truth." I'm like, where'd you get that? He actually got it from the CIA. So there you go. And if they don't know how to shut up, nobody does, right? And so remember that, just know when to not say anything. So I have my tips for a successful interview. I will tell them to you because apparently I didn't put them on the PowerPoint. So the first thing is ask objective questions like when, why, how, please explain. It helps to play dumb. Sometimes I really am dumb when I go, but it really helps to play dumb because if people like to show you how smart they are. And so, but if you want to show them how smart you are, they're going to shut down and they're going to go, okay, well, let her talk, right? But if you play like, I don't know anything, can you inform me, educate me? People are always willing to do that. So I tend to do that a lot. Again, ask open-ended questions because they do encourage conversation. a mistake reporters often make is asking yes or no questions. Sometimes you want to ask yes or no questions. Did you steal that money? Now remember, that's not your first question. It's somewhere in the interview, and you want a yes and no answer, right? That politician I told you about, I spent 3 years investigating him, and finally I was sitting working on a gun story, and an editor came to me and said, this was 3 years, more than 3 years after the fact. An editor came to me and said, I need your help. And I said, well, I'm kind of working on the gun story. He says, Jack Johnson, who's a politician, he says, Jack Johnson's been arrested. I'm like, oh my God. Like, he was 2 weeks from leaving office because of term limits. And I thought, this guy's going to walk away scot-free, all the things that he did, all the, corruption that occurred. Nobody cared. Somebody cared. And so the FBI was at his house when the editor came by my desk, and the FBI, there's an audio. You guys can pull it up. There's an audio. Somehow he was with the FBI, and the FBI gave him his cell phone back. By the way, he was a former prosecutor, so he was a lawyer. His wife was a lawyer. You think, okay, they know things. FBI gave him his phone back. He took it. Now, this is one thing I always tell my students. If the feds, if any law enforcement, they take your phone and they give it back to you, don't take it, because it was bugged. It was wired. And he took it back. The prosecutor takes his phone back, and there's this conversation that's taking place, and it's being wired. And it's his wife talking to him saying, the FBI is knocking on the door, Jack, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to go and get the check? And so he's like, yeah, go get that check. And it was a check for, I can't remember whether it was $15,000 or $150,000. It was some bribe check he had taken, and he had it in the house. And so you could hear her, like, she knew where the check was. So you could hear her rifling through something with other things in it. And she said, Jack, she says, I can't find the check. Where is it? Is it in this drawer? And he's like, yeah, it's in the underwear drawer behind the liquor. And the first thing I'm thinking of, what is going on in that house where there's like liquor in the underwear drawer and a check, and like there's like a serious party going on. So she finds a check, and she says, what do you want me to do with the check? And he says, I don't know, Leslie, flush it. So you hear the toilet flush. She was like scot-free before she flushed that toilet. They had nothing on her, I don't think. And she flushes the toilet, the check goes down. She says, do you want me to go and get the cash in the basement? So I'm thinking of all the stories I missed along the way when she's having this conversation. Like, how come I didn't know there was cash in the basement? So she goes and gets the cash, $79,000 and some change. And she says to Jack, Jack, what do you want me to do with the cash? They're coming in. And you could hear the window break. The feds are outside, and he says, put it in your panties. She stuffed $79,000 in her bra and panties, and the feds come in and they catch her with the evidence, and they arrested her. She went to prison for a year. He went to prison for almost 6. He got out a couple of years ago. And that's one of my favorite stories. On my tombstone, it's like, I did the stories that sent Jack Johnson away. So he doesn't like me. He won't talk to me. I really want to do an interview with him, but for some reason, he won't talk to me. So also, and I'm going to wrap up because I want to give my colleague Scott time to do this, ask one question at a time, right? So often, and I am guilty of this, if you ask more than one question, your subject will choose the easiest one to answer. Every time. I know sometimes it's hard, but if you have 2 questions, ask one and then say, but I have a follow-up, and wait till they answer that question and then come back with your follow-up, right? Let them talk. Let your subject talk. Try not to cut them off in mid-sentence, because if you do, you could be missing crucial information. You never know what they were going to say. It could be something profound, and we all have done it, because, again, we like to show how smart we are. And it's just human nature, I think, to do that when you're having a conversation with somebody, but try not to cut off people. Also, start your interview with questions that build to the point. You want your subject to feel comfortable, and putting them on the spot right away is only going to make them guarded, and it might shut them down. So start with the easier questions and then move to the heart of the issue. However, if you've only got one shot at a question, ask the one that you need answered. Because you don't want to go back and your editor says, oh, what did he say or what did she say about X, Y, and Z? You go, well, I didn't know. I didn't get a chance to get to it. So, if you've got one shot, if you're there with the prime minister or the president or somebody and you got one shot, give it your best shot. Ask the best question. And always be honest with your subject, right? Don't tell someone you want to do a story on crime in the neighborhood when it's really about crimes they may have committed in the neighborhood. I believe in being honest with people. I believe in being upfront with people. Don't lie to them. People can sense it. And don't be phony. They can sense that too, so you have to be genuine. If you find the subject is avoiding answering a question, phrase it in a different way. Again and again and again until you get the answer that you're satisfied with, right? Because that's what you're there for. You're there to get information, and they're there to provide it. Make sure your questions are specific. Vague questions elicit vague answers. And please don't forget to ask follow-ups if you need them. Take good notes and use a recorder. I only use the recorder. Well, now that I'm in radio, I kind of use the recorder, but as a print person, I use it only as backup. Write down the date and the time of your interview, where it occurred, because as time goes on, you will forget these things. Actually, if you don't transcribe your notes right away, you'll find that things fade from your memory. Always ask, I know this is basic, but always ask the correct spelling of someone's name. It really does. I mean, that's the one error I see that's so easily avoidable, right? Just ask them how to spell. They'd rather have you ask them 3 times how to spell their name than for you to get it wrong once, right? Transcribe your notes again as soon as the interview is over. Sometimes if you take notes like I do, you can't read them after a week. So we have our own little shorthand. Always let the subject know that you may need to contact them again, right? I always say that because that way they're maybe expecting the call and it's easier to get through to the person the second time. And they're more likely to talk to you if the interview went well. Well, if it didn't go well, you got to find another way around it. And always let the subject have the last word. Always let them have the last word. Ask them if there is something they'd like to add. And ask them if there's something they forgot to tell you. You never know what you might get. Thanks. I'm gonna go up this way by the steps.
Good morning, Hamburg. I'm Scott Zamost. I'm senior investigative producer at CNBC. Before that, I was at CNBC for 9 years. I was senior investigative producer at CNN, and before that, I was in local news in Miami. I've always done investigative journalism. I'm going to talk specifically today about investigations for interviews, broadcast interviews specifically. How many of you do video, produce video? Okay, great. This applies to print and video, but specifically there's a different technique for long-form video, for long-form investigative. A lot of it's similar but different. I'm going to show a video and give you some examples, but let me start out by saying this. On the video, illegal Airbnbs, Mormon church sex abuse, drug rehab fraud, misconduct in the FBI, all different subjects, all similar approaches, completely different subjects, all similar approaches. And these are all stories that aired on CNBC and CNN, and I'm going to show you specific clips, and I'm going to talk about specific techniques of how we did these interviews. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about, I call those scheduled interviews. I'm also going to talk about what I call unscheduled interviews, when the subject will not talk and it's a last resort, complete last resort. I'm going to show you 2 examples of unscheduled interviews. One that was done when I was at CNN and in conjunction with CNN en Espanol with the foreign minister of Venezuela at the United Nations. And I'm going to talk specifically about logistics and how to do that. And finally, another one with the Postmaster General of the United States. Those were 2 unscheduled interviews. But first, scheduled interviews. The art of the interview starts out with how the interview how we got the interview. And just like Cheryl, you have to be transparent, complete honesty. Don't say you're going to do this. Don't say X, you're going to do Y. It has to be Tell me what the interview is about. I spend, as someone who does this every single day, a lot of my time persuading people to go on camera. I used to be a newspaper reporter, and I can tell you it's exponentially more difficult to get people on camera on an investigation. I spend hours and hours, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. I think one time it took up to a year to convince somebody to go on camera. Getting somebody on camera makes the story better. A statement doesn't do anything. Getting somebody on camera, that's kind of another session, but it's all connected to the actual interview, because I always tell people, first of all, I say, people, I can't force you to be on TV. I can't force you to be on a network. It's up to you. It's totally up to you. But I'll tell you, here's what the story's about. We don't give questions. The policy is not to ever send questions. We can send areas. We don't give questions. But here's what the story's about. And we want to give you the opportunity to respond. That sounds easy, right? But in all these cases, these 4 examples I'm going to show you of the scheduled interviews, not one said yes. It was no, 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 no. Illegal Airbnbs, Airbnb, no. They had not done an interview before on camera about this issue. The Mormon Church, sex abuse in Boy Scouts in the Mormon Church, no. Drug rehab fraud, no. Massive drug rehab fraud, no, which we did in conjunction with the Center for Investigative Reporting. And finally, FBI, serious misconduct in the FBI were obtained confidential misconduct reports in the FBI. The answer was no. Everyone said no, and everyone usually says no. So a lot of my time is spent getting people to say yes. And again, I do that by being honest, being transparent. Here's what the story is. We would love to have you in the story. And I've been pretty successful at it, but there's times, as a last resort, like I said, when people don't, and we have to do an unscheduled interview. If there's one takeaway from this session, and exactly what Cheryl was saying, I can't emphasize enough preparation. It sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised. How do I prepare a correspondent for a television interview? It's like a lawyer. I don't want any answer in that interview that I don't know. I don't want any question interview that I don't know that I have the answer to. It's like, I don't want any surprises. There should be no surprises in that interview. A lot of times, I spend hours and hours and hours with the correspondent going over questions, having like a mock interview. I'll be the subject, they'll be the questions. It's all about, and this involves a lot of detail, a lot of questions, detailed, the tone, as Cheryl referenced, the tone of the interview, on camera, the tone of the interview. It's not about the reporter, it's about the interview. So it can't be about the reporter. There's no performance. It's basically an interview, and you have specific goals in the interview. You'll see that some of the examples, the best interviewers are ones that just basically, they're kind of asking the questions for the public. This is what it is, but it's a very calm way. It's a firm way, but it's not overly aggressive. I may go through dozens and dozens of scenarios. What if they only give us 20 minutes for the interview? Are they going to run out the clock? What if they run out the clock? What if their answers aren't sound bites? What if their answers are bureaucratic gobbledygook? You know, they just give a non-answer. How do we handle that? What if they get really angry and walk out? What do I always tell the crews, don't stop rolling. We have a minimum of 3 cameras on our shoots, sometimes 6 cameras. And we try and do it in a neutral location, but we do it where we have to do the interview. If it's somebody's office, or if it's a suite, or in a hotel, or wherever it is, we're all set up, ready to go. I never have the reporter come in ahead of time. There's no chit-chat, because that leads to pre-interviews, and then the answers are not honest. So I'm there setting up with the crews, and the correspondent comes in at the end. So prepare, prepare, prepare. So what are the main takeaways? I always say we look for those golden moments. Just like in a script, when we write a script, we look for the nuggets. It's kind of like pebbles on the beach. You know, here's one pebble, here's another one. These are ways of telling the story. Well, before we even leave the newsroom, before we even get out the door, we're kind of storyboarding it in our heads how the story would unravel. Now, I say that with an open mind. You never know. You have to keep an open mind on these stories, but we have an idea. We just don't go and shoot the interview. We just don't go and shoot video. So we have an idea of how it is. I want to play. I'm going to play the presentation, and again, and then we can talk about specific examples. I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions. Again, illegal Airbnbs, Mormon church sex abuse, drug rehab fraud, and the FBI misconduct, and then 2 unscheduled interviews, which I think you'll find interesting. These were, again, all examples of people saying no and then sitting down. If you would have told me they would have sat down for an interview, I would have said, that's my dream of vision, for them to sit down for an interview. That's what we want to happen. But at the time when they said no, they said, absolutely not. We don't do this. We'll give a statement. And I can't tell you how many times I say to somebody, well, this is a network investigation, a long-form investigation that will air on CNBC. It will air, there's multi-platforms. It'll air on CNBC.com. It'll air on multiple shows. I mean, we're a business, network, so we're doing financial investigations, and, it has a very dedicated audience. And so I tell them all that, and at the end of the day, they're going to decide or not decide. But I said a statement doesn't do you.
What do you say to Melvin Novak?
I say to him, and to anyone else who has been abused in the church or out of the church, I'm sorry that you've gone through what you've gone through. It's a horrible thing for anybody to be abused.
Clayton made it very clear, unlike decades ago, the Mormon Church has implemented safeguards to try and prevent it.
We want this message to be clear. No child should have to endure child abuse, period.
And only now, 2 weeks before these 2 national news organizations are about to release a major study of what we found was extensive fraud, is the state of California doing this extensive review. Coincidence?
It's not a fair characterization. We've been investigating all along.
My question is why has it taken the state so long to catch up to this?
Look, there are bad people who want to scam this program. And we are going to do everything possible to investigate and deploy the necessary resources to improve and enhance our enforcement effort.
So you feel the state of California has done enough?
Obviously, what has happened and what we see, clearly there's more that needs to be done.
The internal reports show a 14-day suspension for the employee who paid for a sexual favor at a massage parlor. Using a personal cell phone to send nude photographs to other employees got a 10-day suspension. But there was only a 5-day suspension for the employee who repeatedly used a government-issued BlackBerry to send sexually explicit messages to another employee at work. These actions follow misconduct we reported 2 years ago that included sleeping with informants and viewing pornography on bureau computers.
Is that enough punishment for this kind of behavior?
Keep in mind that if you lose a week's pay, that hurts, or 2 weeks' pay in some of those cases. And, we have seen a rash of sexting cases and nude photograph cases, people misusing their bureau BlackBerry for these reasons. And we are hoping that getting the message out in the quarterlies is going to teach people, you can't do this stuff. When you're given an FBI BlackBerry, it's for official use. It's not to text, the woman in another office who you found attractive, or to send a picture of yourself in a state of undress.
For months, we repeatedly tried to get comments from the Venezuelan government.
Entonces, por aquí no hay acceso.
In Caracas, the government threatened CNN and Español's crew with expulsion for just asking about the passport and visa allegations. At a press event, Foreign Minister Rodriguez ignored our question.
Señora Canciller, solo una pregunta.
Months later, during the UN General Assembly in New York, Rodriguez ignored us again.
Canciller.
Until finally we tracked down the foreign minister on the sidewalk outside the UN.
Canciller, ¿qué dice de las alegaciones de que se venden pasaportes venezolanos en la embajada de Bagdad? ¿Qué nos puede decir sobre eso? ¿Qué nos puede decir sobre eso, Canciller? ¿Tiene conocimiento usted como ministra de Relaciones Exteriores?
Te vas a pegar.
Te vas a pegar. ¿Qué nos puede decir
Te
sobre
vas
eso,
a pegar
Canciller?
por estar siguiéndole las mentiras a una persona que no sabe ni lo que está diciendo.
¿Dice que eso es mentira?
Totalmente.
Canciller, ¿qué nos puede decir sobre eso?
As she walked into the UN, Rodriguez
true or
refused
false?
to answer any more questions.
Is there anything you'd like to say?
We'd been asking to interview him for weeks, but were turned down. We caught up with him in the hallway after the hearing.
You've been talking about cutting back.
But then, on a dime, he stopped dead in his tracks, pushed me aside, and slipped into a side door. A few hours after our brief hallway encounter, Potter changed his mind and wanted to talk.
Postmaster General Jack Potter. Nice to see you again. Why did you avoid my questions today in the hallway?
I wasn't avoiding your questions. I was being ushered out of the Congress by my staff.
Surprisingly, Potter said he had no idea about the $1 million houses.
When you brought it to our attention, I was really amazed, and we spent time to look into that policy. We found out that we did have an uncapped value on the price of a house that could participate. We have since gone back and reviewed that entire policy.
Yeah. The former postal. So let me talk for a minute about the unscheduled interviews, because this is something that we rarely do, and it involves an enormous amount of logistics. That Delcy Rodriguez is now the vice president of Venezuela. And we worked on that for a year with CNN Español, and that investigation which aired on CNN and CNN Español when I was at CNN 2 years ago. That story resulted in CNN Español being taken off the air in Venezuela, and it's still off the air in Venezuela. So we could not have done that confrontation in Venezuela, but we could do it in the United States, and this is where I think broadcast difference is completely different from print, is that the logistics, as a producer, the logistics involved in something like this are almost, you'd say, I would never say insurmountable, because I don't think anything is insurmountable, but it involved multiple crews in New York, getting credentials at the UN, and having my counterparts at CNN Español there. And then, how do I find this person? How do we find this foreign minister? And I said, it's going to be easy. We'll just go to the UN and look at where she's speaking. It was not easy. It did not happen that way. We never saw her. She kept updating where she was in New York on Twitter, and every time we showed up, she was gone. And so, a point where the report, the people involved. Part of my job as a producer to be very positive. I'm a very positive person, and keep everybody up and positive, and just and keep focused. And the people you're working with sometimes say, it's not going to happen. We spend all this time, and sometimes I say, it's not meant to be. This is not meant to be for a reason, and this is meant to be for this reason. But I said we're still going to try. And lo and behold, we had been all over New York and to Brooklyn, and we got back, and I said, let's just go back to the Venezuelan mission, which is a block away from the UN. My counterpart at CNN Español was there, and any of you who do video understand this. I always tell the crews, never stop rolling. 2 cameras, 1 camera on the subject, 1 camera on the correspondent. Now, it could be a 2-shot or 1-shot, but just stay your shot. Nothing like this, no snap zooms, just stay steady. And because they're walking backwards, and I'm behind them. And we were there just hanging out, and everybody was kind of deflated, and I said, you know what? we've done our best. And all of a sudden, she appeared walking. And that was, handed the mic to the correspondent from CNN Espanol, who's obviously bilingual, because I said to him, ask the questions in Spanish then English, which he did. And so that's what happened, but and that took maybe 30 seconds, and it was a very dramatic end to a year-long investigation where she completely avoided us. But that's a very important thing, because the allegation was the passports were being sold at the Venezuelan embassy in Baghdad. And it was a very, very difficult story to do, but that's an example. The last example, which is sort of entertaining, is the Postmaster General of the United States at the time. And they didn't want to do the interview, and then they realized it probably is not a good look for him to push the reporter and have that scene, and they said, oh, you can come and do it. And we were on deadline, and we did the interview. So sometimes an unscheduled interview, actually this has happened multiple times, an unscheduled interview leads to a scheduled interview. How are we doing on time? I really can't emphasize this enough. And besides the planning, I say this to people I work with all the time. I say you have to be polite. It sounds so obvious, but being polite gets you a long way. And respectful. Whatever the investigation is, be respectful. The reason those 4 interviews happened is because I was very respectful. I say, this is what I say. I say, I've been doing this for a while. You can look me up on LinkedIn. You could see the stories I've done. I say, all I want to do is tell a full story. I said, you don't have to go on air. It's up to you. It's completely up to you. But if you do, these are the areas we want to talk about. I know some news organizations send specific questions. We don't do that. We can say in areas what we want to talk about. The FBI, we said we wanted to talk about misconduct. They knew we had the reports, the confidential reports. The Mormon Church, which was actually sex abuse in the Boy Scouts, you can imagine the challenge of getting them to sit down, and an elder at the church in Salt Lake City to sit down for an interview. The story about the drug rehab fraud, which we did in conjunction with the Center for Investigative Reporting over a year. That interview was the result of an unscheduled interview. And they said, we're gonna do it. And we don't have conditions for interviews. People say, oh, I'll do the interview of X, Y, and Z. There's no conditions. This is gonna be the interview. It's up to you in the end. So it's not like we're gonna ask this question or this question. This is the interview. A couple other points before we open this up to questions. When you guys do videos, I don't know where you do them, but we try, as I mentioned earlier, we try and do it in a neutral location. Airbnb, they wanted to do it in their office, in their headquarters in San Francisco. A lot of the rooms there are very small. They kind of look like Airbnbs, obviously. But we found a large warehouse-type room that allowed us to set up. The FBI, we did it at the FBI. The interview on the drug rehab fraud with the California official, that was done in a hotel suite. And I remember this is interesting, I don't know if this has ever happened to you, and this is something that would be different from print, obviously. When we got there, they said, oh, we're going to record the interview. I said, no, you're not. That's against our rules, our policy, our standards and practices. You can't record the interview. You can record audio, but you can't record the interview. And there was a whole thing, and they said, well, it's not going to happen. And they backed down. But I've run into that a couple times, multiple times, where people want to record the interview, and then it's more of a copyright issue, but then they can post it. So that's not allowed. And again, we have to be prepared for them walking out. It's rare, but I always tell the crews, keep rolling, keep rolling. If they walk out, you can sit there and be respectful. It's really important to be respectful because people get that vibe, and you could see the tone of each of those correspondents everybody has a different personality, different technique, but they were all respectful, right? And they got the answer to the questions in different ways. I want to wrap up by saying one thing that I mentioned about being positive, and I really believe in this because I always say that it's a privilege to do this. I've been doing this for quite a while. Actually, I've been doing this since I was in high school when I was an investigative reporter for the local paper, and I found misuse in the local ambulance squad, and I said, this is fantastic. You know, I'm getting a result from a story, and we try and affect change, right, of these stories. And in TV and broadcast, you can really have an impact, a tremendous impact on people's lives in a positive way. But every day, I work with a lot of people, work with a lot of correspondents, and sometimes they say, oh, this person, I can't tell how many times, this person canceled this interview, or this is not going to happen, or we can't get this document, or it's going to take forever to get this, these reports. And I say, you know what? This wasn't meant to be. This interview wasn't meant to be, but next week or the week after, we'll have the interview, and it always works out that way. I always say, if one door closes, another door will open, and it's kind of like every day we're facing a wall on these stories, and it's a door, and if you can't get the story around the back of the door, you go around the side. There's always a way in and getting the story. Thank you.
All right, you can come up. Scott. Come up here. So we're open for questions, sir.
Yes, the reality of TV interviews is so the reality of TV interviews is the following situation. Could you please say it again? Could you please say it in a shorter way? Could you please say ABC so that I have it on tape? Oh, you started with the wrong beginning. Please, could you say it again? So my experience is these interviews are often completely pre-scripted, and the camera team is just going to have this few sound bites, and this is what you can see on the German TV every evening, and I hate it. And what is your policy about that?
Our interviews aren't scripted at all, and we have a goal in mind. We have definitely a goal in mind. The interview could take 20 minutes. It could take an hour, but no, there's no one size fits all. It depends on the interview. It depends on who you're interviewing. So the approach has to be custom for that specific interview. We're gonna have a different approach from the Mormon Church and the FBI. It just depends on the story. But it's very important to keep an open mind. With all this preparation, these mock interviews we do, these questions, everything I've said this morning, I think everything, and Cheryl would agree, it's really important to keep an open mind, because if you might learn something in the interview, even though you're 100% prepared, and the story's not done until you're fully researching the story. So it's really important to say to the correspondent, you have to keep an open mind. The story's not over. Your research is over. You have to be able to be fair and transparent. You can't have any preconceived notions. It's really important.
There was a young woman in the green in the back, and there's a microphone going around. He has it. Thank you.
Hi, I would like to ask about so when we conduct the interview to the people who commit the crimes, for example, like the military or the government officials or the police, we mostly like to have to go to their territory, like their office or their house, for example, like a military compound, a police compound, etc. And we will be asking difficult questions, like the questions they will hate us. So what kind of precaution would you do for your physical security in terms of the situation?
So if you were going to their home, I would take someone with me. I wouldn't go alone. If you're going to like a police compound, a jail, where are they going to go? They're locked up, right? So I wouldn't feel as threatened there. But always trust your instincts. Like if it feels uncomfortable, figure out another way to do it. I once did an interview with a young man who had killed someone and gotten away with it. And police had never gone after him. And so I tracked him down through Facebook, actually. And he came to the phone. We set up an interview for the next day, because when people like that, people who aren't used to us or don't really want to talk, when they agree to it, do it as soon as possible so they don't have a chance to change their mind. So I called one of my police sources, because I thought, this guy, I was going to his home. I was taking a photographer with me. But I was going to someone's home I didn't know. I knew he had guns in the house, right? Because he shot somebody. It wasn't like he tossed the gun. And he probably had more than one. And so I called my police source and I said, because I felt uneasy, I said, what advice do you have for me? I'm going to interview this guy who killed somebody. He says, it's probably the worst piece of advice I had. But it was really savvy in a way. He says, never turn your back on a killer. I'm like, what does that mean, right? I'm like, okay, so literally when I'm at his house, he gets a phone call. He's on the phone, he's not saying anything. The phone keeps ringing, he's listening. Finally, he hands the phone to me, and I'm like, what? And it was his aunt, and she was really angry that I was there because she knew that there's no statute of limitations on murder and that the police could still come after him. And so he got off the phone and he said to me, now my photographer's there. Mind you, my Italian, grew up in Italy photographer with tattoos up his arm, love this guy. The guy says to me, I think you should leave. As I turned, my photographer is out the door, getting in the car, starting the motor, and I thought about what my police source said to me, never turn your back on it, and I didn't. And I backed out, and I said, come walk me to the car, right? Because I thought, I don't know what this guy meant, but it means I don't want to get shot. And so but the lesson there is just trust your instinct. Right? I could have stayed. I could have said, when he said, I think you should leave, I'm like, no. But no. When somebody tells you that, like, trust your instincts and I had what I needed anyway. He ended up on the front page. And the police never went after him even after that, but that's a whole nother story. So he still got away with murder. But I'd say trust your instincts. Scott?
For what we do, we have legal and editorial guidelines. So if I'm doing a door knock, the crew stays on the sidewalk. I can go up to somebody's door. The crew stays on the sidewalk. They don't go up to the door with me. And sometimes I'll say, you know what? You stay in the car. I did a story. I didn't have a reporter there. I did a story on. We did an investigation of employees at Disney who were arrested for sex crimes. This is when I was at CNN. And yes, and I ended up going to Orlando and knocking on many doors of people of Disney employees who had been arrested for sex crimes, and they were being arrested in these sting operations. So I knocked on the door, and this guy answered, and he had just gotten out of jail, and it was just me and him at the door. I said to the photographer, just stay in the car. I used to work in Florida. I said, just stay in the car. And I said, I don't want to intimidate him. And I talked to him for an hour at the door, off camera. And I said, it would be great to have you in the story. I know this is not comfortable. And the more you talk to somebody, the more they feel comfortable with you. And he agreed to an interview the next day. And I said to him, your lawyer's going to tell you not to talk to us. But I ended up talking to me. And there wasn't time to have a correspondent fly in. I just did the interview. A lot of times producers do, we're off-camera reporters. We do the interviews depending on the situation. But so it's a matter of each situation is different. I can't emphasize that enough. It's not one size fits all. But Cheryl's right. If any time I feel unsafe, the reporter feels unsafe, and anybody in the crew feels unsafe, we don't do it. We just do not do it.
And I could say, too, that chances are somebody who just got out of prison doesn't want to go back, so they may be okay to deal with because, they've been there, done it, and wasn't pleasant. So, yes, sir. And then the lady in the back. Yeah, yes, please.
Thanks. So do you have like a standard tactic or argument that you employ when trying to get people who know they're going to be the target of a critical story and are reluctant to talk to open up to you? For example, you mentioned the sheriff. Well, he just talked to you, but like if he had said, no, I don't want to talk with you, like what kind of argument, rhetoric do you employ in that case? And secondly, what do you do when
What about the one question at a time?
Oh, sorry.
Because I'm probably going to pick the second one because it's going to be easier, but go ahead.
So yeah, that's a good point. So sometimes I get interviewees who want to know how I feel about the situation. And I get the sense that they want to sort of get a feeling of, am I on their side? Am I sympathetic? So how do you approach a situation like that?
I'll take the first question. The sheriff, I got lucky with the sheriff because I think the reason he was so upfront and honest with me was because he knew he was dying. because he died literally like a couple of months later. And that's why I think because I couldn't believe how candid he was. I thought, I know law enforcement. I've never seen someone who runs a department basically throw his people under the bus, but he threw them under the bus because they had done wrong. And that's what I think. But other times, I think most people who are targets of our investigation often are public officials. They're used to us. It's kind of hard to have a persuasive argument for them because they've heard it all. But also, I think just telling them, look, this is your chance to tell your side of the story. This is your chance to say whatever it is you want to say about this. And sometimes that works. No, he had a part two. He had a follow-up.
Part two?
How you, the reporter, feel about this. Sometimes they'll ask you how you feel about the story. Like, are you sympathetic to them?
Oh, if they ask you questions about your opinion, I mean, we're not in the business of giving personal opinions. You have to set aside that. We're supposed to be objective and fair. So, and if you have an open mind, you're not. I can't emphasize this enough. You can't prejudge. So, if somebody asks me, what do you think? I'd say I'm doing research on the story, whether it's been weeks or months or whatever time period. I said the research isn't over until the story airs, and then there may be even more. You're continuing to learn the process, and I think people respect that. They understand that you're not going in with a story written and asking questions based on a story written. You're going in with trying to elicit information.
Yeah, because there are a lot of people I've investigated that I personally liked, and it's like, oh, well, it is what it is. Now, Jack Johnson wasn't one of those people. He just wasn't a very likable guy, but I still, it didn't matter whether I liked him or not. The evidence, the facts were the facts. And so you have to always, that the facts matter. Facts, there's an old saying, never let the facts get in the way of a good story. That's not true. Facts do matter. And so whatever it is you may think about the situation or the person, it doesn't matter because it doesn't affect my life. So, I'm here representing, readers and listeners and viewers, and, it's my job to hold people accountable. And so if I have to do that, I do that, and it doesn't matter what I think of them personally. There was a question in the back, the young woman in the back. Is it a woman or a guy? I can't see.
It's a guy.
Over there. It's a guy over there. Okay.
So you were talking to that guy at his door for an hour. How do you avoid having him saying crucial things that you want to have on camera, but getting him to talk on camera later?
That's a great question. If I'm in the mode of trying to convince somebody, and that's not an everyday thing, knocking a door and talking to somebody for an hour in that kind of situation, a tense situation, my whole goal there is to it's not about the interview, it's persuading them to go on camera. So my laser focus is how to do it. Usually, if I can get in somebody's house, if they invite me into their home, that's a great, it will probably get them on camera. I mean, there's no guarantees in any of this, but I'm not really worried about what they're going to say on camera at that point because I'm just trying to persuade them to go on camera. But I always say, we're going to ask, this is what the subject is about. This is the subject, so there shouldn't be any surprise to you, and that's kind of the way I do it. It's really interesting when you tell somebody it's up to you. I mean, how many of you who've done this just say, it's up to you? It's up to you. It's up to you to do the interview. I put it on them.
I don't.
I do. I say in the end.
To me.
I say, well, but I think that people feel I don't want to put undue pressure on somebody who's probably in a situation. I want to just be fair, and I say in the end of the day, we'd love to have you on camera. Been very successful in getting people to talk on camera, and the story. And you look at the story. Look how much better the story is when this person went on camera. And over a period of time, they either decide to or don't. And usually they decide to.
Yes, over there with the black jacket.
I was just going to ask, what's your policy with pre-interviews for subjects? Like, do you do them for some people and then not for others?
That's a great question.
The other question I had too is, what about off-the-record interviews? Like, would you do them to then try to get that person to talk later?
Can I just say, clearly you all didn't listen to me when I said one question at a time.
Sorry,
Okay.
I'm sorry.
But they're both good
I gotta
questions.
get a lot of questions in.
Can I take the first one really quick? We don't have off the record conversations. We have a background conversation. So I could say somebody, I'm going to talk to you on background. We could use the information, but we can't have the name. As far as pre-interviews, no. That's a mistake to go in and a lot of companies will say, oh, come on in, we'll talk to you, and it's all off the record. No, we don't do that. I don't do that because then you're setting yourself up for failure by doing that.
So I have done that. I don't do it with public officials because they know the rules, but people who aren't media savvy, I try to cut them a little slack. And I do it on my terms. If I'm just trying to understand an issue and what went on, I would say, well, listen, because I know I could probably get somebody else to go on the record. So if I could get somebody to just explain it to me and the only way they'll talk is off the record and I know there's somebody willing to go on the record, then I'll do it. But I call the shots. I don't let anyone define the interview for me and say, well, I'll only talk to you off the record. And it's like, well, no, that's not going to work for me because people can say anything they want when their name is not attached. And so if you're going to be bold enough to accuse someone of something, put your name to it. Right, your credibility. My credibility as a reporter, their credibility as a source is on the line there.
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
Censorship is not only a question of living in Saudi Arabia or in Vienna. Please use the microphone. Censorship sometimes is also a question for media houses in democracies. Can you give an example when your boss or your editor told you went too far, we won't publish it, we won't send it?
No, I've never had an editor say that they wouldn't publish something. No. The one thing about being an investigative reporter or being a reporter in general is like you better be darn sure when you pitch something that you can follow through with it and get it. Because if an editor gives you, whatever time, 6 months, a year, I've worked as long as 2 years on a piece, it better be good. And they're not gonna waste that time either by not publishing it. You spend a lot of time, you've got everything you need. I've never had that happen, but
they might say you don't have the story yet, or you might have half a story, but that's why you're constantly pushing yourself for a better and better story. You might be at this level, but you want to get to this level.
I think that's why it's also good to talk to your editor along the way so that you're both on the same page and so you don't get to a point where they go, well, we can't publish this, right? But if you communicate along the way, then you can sort of take the pulse of how well you're doing with the story. And there was a question, yes. And we could take one more after that.
One more question after
or two.
Do you have some usual and efficient methods or techniques or arguments that you use when someone don't want to talk to you and you try to get them?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, what I normally say is we've been working on the story, and here we'd like to get you on camera. We're television, like to get you on camera. Then I go into all the reasons why I think it's a good idea. And it's a process. They never give you an answer immediately. But I go through I'm very specific about the process. And a lot of times, as Cheryl mentioned, people have never, if it's not a public official, somebody who's never been on TV, they have no idea what's involved. Well, where's the interview? Is it at the network? Where is the interview? Where it happened? Basic questions. So I try and assuage people's anxiety about it. But at the end of the day, it's up to them. I can make the arguments, but I really say, you know what, it's up to you. And if you don't do it and you just give a statement, here's how it's going to look in the story.
Sometimes what I do is I'll call people I know and say, hey, do you know somebody who would talk to me about this? And then when I call that person, I say, well, Scott Zamost referred me to you. And sometimes that connection will work because they're like, oh, well, I know Scott and I really trust Scott, so she must be okay if Scott referred her. So that works a lot of times as well.
That's great. One more question?
We got time for two.
Two more?
The gentleman back in the woman in the second row.
While doing these kind of investigative interviews, mostly reporters have crews with them, right, on camera and to assist with other technical aspect. But for someone who is shooting on her own and asking the questions herself, it is very difficult to focus on your questions and then the technical part like I do. So sometimes I tend to focus more on the technical sides, and then I miss out the most important answers from any person I'm interviewing. So what is the tip that...
So you're doing it by yourself. You're shooting.
I'm shooting
you're
myself,
shooting and doing the
editing
interview
myself,
yourself,
and doing the stories myself. So sometimes it's very, very difficult because you want the right angle, you want the right answers from the person, but you end up getting nothing, bad framing, because you are focusing on technical aspects. So what is the tip, apart from getting many people?
Write your questions down. Write your questions down. Just have write them on your hand if you have to, because if you've got to shoot, and you can't, write them on your hand and go, okay, because you're doing this all by yourself, so you have to be creative. Come up with whatever way.
It's definitely a higher bar.
Don't do it in pencil work or sweat.
I know a lot of journalists who are one-man bands or MMJs, and it's definitely you're 100% correct. It's definitely a lot more difficult doing it by yourself. It's totally doable, but not having this whole support system of crews and lighting and all that. But you're right. But that's a good idea as well.
Yes, ma'am.
Should I repeat, or did people hear?
You can repeat it. It's
okay.
Fine.
So I was just wondering if you guys had any good strategies for long-winded speakers or people who don't really take breaths, where you can kind of change the topic. People who go on tangents. Do you have any kind of strategies that you use in those situations?
Yeah, you look at them and go, "Could you shut up so I could get a question in?" No, you don't do that. But you always want to control your interview. You always have to stay in control of your interview. And people do go off. They go off. Sometimes they go off on purpose, right, to sort of throw you off. But just when you've had enough and you think they're starting to ramble, you interrupt politely and go, I'm sorry, my question was blah, 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 blah. You have to maintain control of your interview. If not, I've had it happen with public officials. I used to cover the Justice Department. John Ashcroft was the Attorney General at the time. I think this must have been under Bush. And he called on me once. It was rare. He called on me because they always called on TV people, and we print people always got snubbed. And I asked a question, and I'm like, what is this guy talking about? He's not even remotely answering the question. Well, he was a little more difficult to cut off because he's the Attorney General. But I interrupted, and I said, I'm sorry, I have a follow-up. And then I just repeated the same question, which he still didn't answer. But, so you just have to try to maintain control of the interview. And when you find that either you've got what you need or you find that people are going off point, you have to subtly bring them back to point, and it's doable. Scott?
Oh, can I just follow up? I was also wondering if it was...
She shut me up, didn't she? Brought it back to point. Good job.
Just wondering, and maybe you can answer this, but if the strategy is any different, if it's not an official that you're speaking to, but maybe a survivor or somebody who you're trying to be a little more sensitive around.
Oh yeah, if it's not a classic investigative interview, it's completely different. Then you really have to be a great listener. Letting people speak, and silence is golden. Have you guys ever done interviews where you just don't say anything? It's amazing what people will say if you just are quiet. But it's a good question, because sometimes on interviews, and we prepare for that, of people running out the clock. Oh, you'll have 20 minutes for the interview, and then they'll just talk and talk and talk. It'll be a very clunky, bureaucratic answer, and they do this intentionally. So we're very aware of that, and we're careful about interrupting people, but at some certain point, we have to get to the next issue.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably, is this lunchtime? So
yeah.
There's no panel coming in? If you guys have other questions?
If you guys want to...
If there's no
If you guys want to talk to us afterwards, thank you very much. We'll be
Thank
here.
you guys for coming. Appreciate it.